So Zav, thanks for taking time out of your very busy schedule to talk with us on Tenor Cross Conversations today.
It's good to be with you, Duke.
So you have done a lot of different things with a lot of different organizations in the nonprofit area, in various administrations, in the federal government, and you're now heading up What Works Plus, which we're going to get to. So first of all, give us a little bit of the trajectory of your career and what led you into the work you're doing today. I know there's a lot there, but give us, if you will, a somewhat compressed story about that.
Sure. I started out in community development work, so paying attention to how local communities change, how to invest in them in really effective ways, make sure there's housing, primary health care, vibrant businesses, local people have good jobs. And that's a very holistic frame. There's a lot in that, of course, a lot of different leverage points you need, a lot of different kinds of expertise, but I loved it. I loved the fact that it was all those things. Did some environmental work as well. The earlier days of sort of testing, when a bank wanted to buy a property, that kind of thing, just sort of doing a review.
And you seem to have an attentiveness to place.
Yeah.
We both spent time at MIT. Believe it or
Yeah.
not, I taught there, but you were very familiar with community planning and urbanism
right.
and other things. So like us, I think you have a great awareness of what it means for people to be in a place, what a community is.
That's exactly right. I was a community planner for a while and found that the work we were doing in the South Bronx in New York City was of great interest in other parts of the country. So I would travel around and meet with communities and talk about what they were trying to accomplish. Always very attentive to place and how people were trying to live well and govern well and tackle problems together, in a place. It sounds so quaint these days, maybe, but it's essential. And has such long roots in our country. Later on, I taught city planning and public policy at MIT and at Harvard for a while, and I had the chance to go and work in the federal government. Didn't expect it, but it just sort of presented itself. And I worked at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That was in the Clinton days. Went back to teaching and writing for a while, then worked in the Obama White House and helped put together the Recovery Act and think about the recession we were facing in those days and the foreclosure crisis, and again, how communities were being hit hard by that, how families were struggling. And then I had the opportunity to work at one of the world's biggest nonprofit philanthropies, the Ford Foundation, which has a lot of history. It gave us public broadcasting and Sesame Street and all kinds of higher ed innovations, and helped really to give birth to the field of community development back in the 60s and 70s. So was very privileged to do that work. And now I'm at a nonprofit public policy think tank, one of the oldest in the country, the Brookings Institution. And again, tackling the needs of cities and regions. And that includes, by the way, rural communities that are now on the front lines of, for example, the clean energy revolution and manufacturing and so much more.
Well, the Tenor Cross geography covers those rural areas. And as we've seen, there's a great discrepancy between often their access to resources, education, and other things as people gravitate towards cities. I think you point out in your writings, and we've referenced this many times, 70, 80, almost 90% of the economic muscle in this country is coming in our metropolitan areas. And sometimes you can feel left out if you're not there. So I'm sure you were invited into the federal government and various administrations because of what you wrote about in the book, The Geography of Opportunity, Race and Housing Choice in Metropolitan America, which is now about 15 years old. But the topics seem more relevant than ever. Describe what you, again, returning to geography and place and experience of communities, what you were talking about in this book that you felt needed to be remedied, some of which feels like it is by things with like Justice 40 and other components of the Biden-Harris administration.
Duke, this too has a long history in our country. I think if you go to most people and you say that where you're born and where you grow up helps to determine your life chances and the quality of your life and the opportunities you have, that strikes people as almost common sense. What we were trying to do, and all kinds of people contributed to that book years ago, was lay out exactly why and how the country is changing too, under all kinds of forces. An aging of our population as people live longer, of course, people moving about within the country or migrating to this country, also something that shaped us throughout our history. And we were pointing out that, we're becoming more diverse than ever before. Also, we're seeing earlier days back then, but what's become much more evident to everybody, and that is the growing economic inequality in our country. Pretty extreme in a lot of ways. And outline some ideas for what to do about this. And if I could name just one thing, to your point about some things have changed, some things haven't, we have spent a lot of time and energy and also had real political conflicts over the inequality within some of our major urban areas, for example, the neighborhoods within Houston or greater New York or Miami or fill in the blank. Smaller cities as well, of course, Birmingham, many others. We have had fewer answers and, frankly, not enough energy and attention paid to the inequality between regions and to entire regions that have been distressed, in some cases for generations, losing talent, losing population, economic vitality. We haven't had great answers for a lot of those places, and it's no wonder, they feel overlooked by, both the major parties and a lot of what they see in the media and a lot of the conversation about change. So I've also focused a lot of energy, especially in recent years, on that challenge and helping regions that have been left behind as we think about things like the future of everything from food security and energy security and having climate resilient states and local places to manufacturing and our global competitiveness. And often, as you know well, the kind of land you need or natural resources you need for some of these things exists mainly in rural communities or at kind of the rural-urban edge, if you will. So I think it's more important than ever before that we figure this stuff out and be fair to places.
And this is why we selected the geography that we did, in that we think some of these issues, as we often say, are in their highest relief. Some of the extremes that we see in the southern tier of the country, booming cities, booming industries, and then people trying to find their way in not forgotten communities, but the spaces in between that don't get the attention they deserve and often suffer the greatest impacts with regard to the byproducts of industry and or climate change preparedness and those kind of things. So we've grounded this conversation in our mutual interest in place and the experience of places and the people who are there. The focus of our conversation today was to be to some degree about climate financing and things like that. Before we do that, let's talk about how that financing or funding gets distributed and your really interesting take on government. I really enjoyed your paper, A More Democratic Federalism. It seems in a nutshell, you're describing the value of understanding how these places and communities at the local level govern themselves or want to govern themselves. Sometimes that's hard with states and federal organizations overseeing them. But you have a strong belief in our ability to problem solve at the local level and combine that with federal and state processes. So talk a bit about what you think needs to happen in government for us to distribute some resources maybe more effectively.
Yeah. Boy, this is, as we discuss in that essay, this is kind of one of our oldest debates, a never-ending debate in America, because it gets to how we divvy up under a constitutional form of democracy authorities and also money. The power to raise it and to spend it and to direct how it should be spent, including things like naming specific goals, right, and putting conditions. So this is really fundamental to the way our system works or should work. And we think we're due for a reboot. It's not so popular to say, well, let's look at how we pay for public education or the kinds of investments our communities need to be truly climate resilient and economically prosperous and resilient too going into the future. But what we need to, because when the status quo is holding us back, sometimes it's these really structural things, that are making everything harder to see, like where our common ground is, how to drive real innovation that serves everybody, etc. So happy to get into more specific ideas.
One of those structural things is pretty obvious, and you mentioned it very specifically, the length of terms of office for people.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about difficult questions that require an extended focus, and sometimes getting reelected, spending a lot of time on getting reelected, distracts people from these issues and or their ability to really make impactful change, given you're in office for 4 years, 6 years, sometimes 2 years. And so it's something you mentioned as being critical to understanding our ability to tackle big issues, this length of term in office. You wanted to say anything more about that?
Sure. I traveled and talked to a lot of audiences around this country, in small towns as well as real big cities, and sometimes abroad as well. And often ask people, how many of you have heard of NIMBY? Most hands in the room go up, not in my backyard. And then I ask, well, how about NIM2? Almost no hands go up. NIM2 is just a shorthand for what you just said. It stands for not in my term of office. And it's not in any way a partisan critique. It's not about anyone who's sitting in office right now. It's just a reality of public life, especially in small d democratic societies where there's real political competition and terms and elections matter, that it is hard to take the hard decisions now, ask people to make sacrifices now or accept costs now for risks they're going to avoid years and years from now, or benefits they're going to see years from on somebody else's term of office potentially. So our lives are just run through with questions like that. Climate action certainly is full of them, many of the tough choices there and the big changes we need to see. But also, the conversation we're having a few minutes back about left behind regions or parts of regions, it's certainly an issue I know throughout the 10 across. Economic restructuring, to use a little jargon for a second, like changing the basis for your economy, what you compete on, in addition to how you build your talent and attract businesses and all that. It's often been described as turning around an aircraft carrier in a pond. It's hard, tends to be slow, even when you have people with a willingness to try and work together. It's not overnight quick fix stuff. It just isn't. And if anything, we have a public life that tends to reward candidates for sort of promising quick results, and getting expectations up, and then disappointing voters, which only leads to more distrust in the system.
And again, I read throughout your writings a degree of optimism about what this country can be and our ability to make some of those changes. But you would probably, and you do acknowledge, this is a particularly fraught time where even terms like federalism are debatable as to what that means to certain people and what they really intend. So how do you square, to some degree, your optimism and suggestions, which seem very rational and are nonpartisan? They really are structural, if you will, making sure you get the greatest representation of the people and their interests into government and reflected there. But we are in a really difficult time. How do you take that into account right now when you'd like to see your message be probably better received? Hasn't been negatively received. It's just a difficult time to make the case for some of these things.
That's right. I think that where we do see some breakthroughs, and not everything, of course, happens in the form of legislation, but let's keep in mind for a second, in this election year, that we have seen the enactment at the federal level, notwithstanding all the partisanship, all the finger pointing and everything else. We have seen the enactment of really important public investment laws in our manufacturing, our infrastructure. And some of them were more party line, but several of them were solidly bipartisan.
Right.
And I think, part of the answer to the important question you ask is right in there in how those things came to pass. Each of them, of course, has a sort of long backstory, but the gist, if you will, was appealing to a range of interests, old-fashioned, like find the common ground, agree on the things that the American people all over the country must have from our government, and certain things uniquely the federal government must do. It has to lead on certain things, whether it's foreign economic policy for given reasons, or these mega bets on our manufacturing base, on our industrial base, first time in generations. First time, at least in sort of civilian applications. We've often invested on the defense side. And you see in those conversations just the range of interests in play. Everyone interested in things, of course, like good jobs and bringing vitality to regions. but also in things like our competitiveness with China and other rivals overseas, the future of critical technologies like artificial intelligence and the chips they depend on. Well, chips are in everything these days, as you know,
Right,
from your,
right.
your appliances to your car to your. But it really was recognizing enough common ground, agreeing to disagree on other stuff, that got these big bills over the line, especially in 2021 and 2022. And I find the same is basically true at the state and local level as well. Notwithstanding all the things we disagree about, that when you're able, and we've done work, for example, in a pretty wide array of places in terms of their voting patterns and whatnot, from Indiana and Georgia to California and Alabama and more. And, many might be surprised if they pay attention only to the political news headlines, to who's proposing what to the states. I'll give you a quick example. Ohio, with state leadership, is looking at major expansions in everything from computer chips to the transition to EVs and data centers and much more, and not without controversy, let's be fair. But within 4 months, thanks to the state saying, we've got to be on this if we want to be really strategic about these sectors. We can't take a siloed approach to this. That won't work. We need to be really forward-looking. Do you know that in 4 months, the state office called Jobs Ohio worked with the major manufacturers and about 23 different community colleges in their system, and created a model manufacturing tech curriculum that's going to shrink to 1 year the time it takes to get a certificate, with fantastic starting wages and the opportunity for upward mobility. We can do things. We actually can, and all over the country, and I've seen it.
We're proving that here in Arizona. You probably know a bit about what we're doing, and it compares with Ohio and Intel and the CHIPS Act. The scale of the investments out here, $65 billion by TSMC, with support from the federal government, and then Intel as well, with their counterparts in Portland and Ohio. So we're doing that as well. But it is the result, as you mentioned, of these big, let's call them forward-thinking investments, the IRA and the infrastructure law and other things. So given that we're meant to talk about finance here, the distribution of those monies, and maybe hinting at what we talked about before, where they go and how they go, talk about your, again, optimism about these investments and then their distribution. What do you think about those patterns?
Well, a couple of things should get our attention here, it seems to me. First of all, using the public money to catalyze the private. That word catalyze maybe is thrown around loosely sometimes, but that's tremendously important. And so is a second thing, and this has not been without controversy. You saw a lot of talk about this, let's say, around this time last year. The federal government was figuring out the terms for competing those dollars you just referred to, that private companies would receive. And one point of view was sort of, if you put conditions on it, you're going to mess with the sort of genius of the market and what's practical for business, et cetera, et cetera. It's really important that people in our country understand, again, we can agree to disagree on all kinds of things, but other countries, when they've invested public money in this kind of pump priming sort of way, in this genuinely catalytic way, they always put conditions on it. And they've done so in really smart ways, and they've learned how to prove that over time. For example,
and when you say conditions,
yes,
I think you're talking about some of the adjacent things, not just money, let's say, going directly to the making of a chip.
Right.
But how the people who might be in those jobs or the surrounding communities, or what that means for next generations coming up with regard to education or the quality of their environment, those conditions are what you see, and maybe the government sees, as opportunities to do some additional things besides just build factories and more chips, and that there's an obligation to include those in these major moves.
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the first things we said, ink was barely dry on the bill, and we said, let's think for a moment about things that have happened here in our country that weren't typical and what we can learn from them, like BMW going to South Carolina about 30 years ago. In moving in, acquiring land and planning to build what would become their number one production plant for one of their popular SUVs, not just bought here in America now, but it shipped all around the world. Brand new industry at that time, 30 years ago for South Carolina, a state that had lost a lot of jobs in the older industries. And what we highlighted, this piece came out in Fortune magazine on the fall of 2022, was that BMW ran around asking questions that a lot of us aren't used to in our communities when there's a conversation about a big company and a big investment. Like, how do we make sure that we grow as much local talent as we possibly can? How do we build the local supplier base? We'd like to source right here in your region as much as we can, because that works for us in Germany. That's our model. We find we're at our best when we're literally down the road from the people making our parts, and we can innovate together, and we can succeed together as a productive complex or set of networks. The economic development term sometimes is cluster, which means just what it sounds like, concentration of firms and higher ed institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So BMW has done all that, and South Carolina and other states have really seen the benefits. And it's funny you mentioned Taiwan Semiconductor. So there's a good example of a world-leading company with, until now, essentially no production experience in America. And we think it's important that everyone engage in these conversations, whether they're dealing with that company or with Intel, an American brand, or somebody else, Micron. Help engage them in the conversation you want to have, which is including local development and local equity and, of course, climate resilience and all these things we need to look ahead and think about, not just the narrow conversation about the cost of doing business or the things that will facilitate their building the plant, of course, as important as those things are.
Right. And there have been heated or let's call them very compelling engagements about the role of the private sector, the role of the private sector coming from abroad, and then the response or responsibility to the local community. And as we point out, some of these conditions could be perceived by some as extracurricular activities and maybe don't need to be paid so much attention to. But we're finding out here, it's not easy to move a giant company from elsewhere to here. And I think our local government, our mayor in particular, and others have really done everything they could possibly do to accommodate those who are coming to this country. There are many coming from Taiwan for TSMC and elsewhere, to make them feel, if you will, at home, but also to bring the best of what they can import here from Taiwan and what we can learn from them. And we have different ways of working, and there are frictions along the way, but I think they're being worked out. But there is a role for government to play as the convener with dollars to help make this stuff happen. It's with real intentionality. And I think sometimes people forget the government can play that role effectively. In addition to distributing dollars, somebody has to help bring parties to the table at the state, federal, and local level, which I think gets back to your interest in a more vibrant federalism. How do all of these layers work together?
That's exactly right. If you think about the conversation we're having earlier about terms of office, boy, is it important that we really work hard. We've got to be realists now, I think, but it's important that we work hard to do some long-range planning. We're not always known for that. It's harder in that system where terms of office are shorter.
Right.
As we know, CEO stints sometimes are not all that long as well. It's a hot topic in the corporate sector. Quarterly earnings and the short-term thinking can dominate, right, a lot of what's going on in the market.
There is no doubt we are the beneficiaries in Arizona, and certainly at Arizona State University, to the tenure of a president, which is now getting on 22, 23 years, with no signs of slowing down, which is engaged in these discussions with corporate leaders about what is the role of a university to the surrounding community and to industry, but to have the longevity and stick-to-itiveness matters a lot. It's why we have been able to do some things, and it's pointed to time and time again where, just like CEOs, I think the tenure of a university president is hovering somewhere between 5 and 7 years. That's enough time to maybe do your listening tour, get some things going, have a strategic plan, but not enough time to implement and then to adjust along the way, which is required. And you make your own luck by having these plans, which is why TSMC is coming here. So I think that your initial conversation about the length of time people who are decision makers are in office, how funding is appropriately and strategically distributed, really matters.
Yeah. Your university is a case in point. No, it is a perfect example. And, if you think about developing those major productive capabilities in your region, like elsewhere, facing similar challenges, some of the things that are most top of mind for people, of course, are things like natural resources.
Yes.
Computer chip plants need a lot of water, not just land.
A lot of discussion about that here, as you might imagine.
Big deal, big deal. But in addition, I always urge people to think about the pains of growth too. And this is particularly important in poorer regions that may not right now have a ton of economic vitality. And every dollar invested is a good dollar when you haven't seen vibrant industries and sometimes in generations. And what I mean by pains of growth is, take the Silicon Valley as an extreme. They have an extreme housing shortage now. It didn't occur overnight. It was the failure to look ahead and think about the housing they would need. And over time, as the information technology sector and biotech and the other major sectors grew, and by failing to do so over many terms of office now, and across sectors, public, private, higher ed, and so on, that they find themselves in a deep, deep hole where they're now losing talent. They have major problems with the kind of commutes that people are doing because they can't find anywhere to live if they're living on modest wages. So, my advice to Arizona and others is think ahead now. Upstate New York, the same thing. They've had very affordable housing for a long time,
Right.
partly because they lost industry. And of course, house prices stayed moderate. But you're not going to be where you are now forever, and now's the time to think about things like land supply and working together, cities and suburbs, to create it.
So you're talking about the upside of industry doing well, communities growing, like this one and elsewhere. There are other places where we've seen industries decline and people moved out. But you also mentioned how some of this money and financing from the federal government and elsewhere should go towards the impact of climate change. So last week on this discussion, we were talking to Abram Lustgarten, whose recent book speaks to climate-induced migration and where people will be moving. And one of the people in his book says, if anybody thinks the Midwest and the Great Lakes region won't experience a major influx of people, you're not paying attention to the signals that the climate and other things are sending. So talk about financing, where it comes from, and how it needs to respond to the changes that you're seeing in the climate, which is going to cause some people to think about housing and or other things.
That's right. It's tremendously important, and there are kind of a couple of big pieces to it. First is, I think we're in the early days and months now of seeing the insurance industry respond to climate risk. It's not like hurricanes, tornadoes, other extreme events or anything new, of course.
Right.
But the losses have so mounted, insurance rates have climbed, insurers, major ones, State Farm and others, have pulled out of writing certain kinds of policies in some parts of the country, writing them at all. And that should get our attention, and it's getting policymakers' attention as well. And I mention it just to say one important piece of finance in this picture, in a climate-affected America and world, is, of course, the mortgage markets. They're huge.
Yes.
They connect directly to the biggest single source of wealth, in our country and for most families. So that's one important piece of the finance picture, and we are simply going to have to start reflecting climate risk in a more direct way.
And listeners to this broadcast and or our summits will note that we've had insurance representatives at the highest level on stage and or speaking to us in the states most affected, the Californias, the Louisianas, the Floridas, where those insurance are moving out, and even the reinsurers are having some challenges coping with the market. And I think a lot of people have looked at insurance as the leading indicator because it's so data driven around the topic of risk.
That's right.
But what about the finance for those communities that we were talking about earlier that's sometimes overlooked, that need support, that can see the impact of climate change ahead of them, and the thoughtful potential, and it's happening already, relocation of people and or making communities more resilient? How do you see governmental finance and or private sector weighing in to assist with those situations?
Well, we're seeing, and we're going to see a whole lot more of two other things that we haven't talked about yet. One, funding, and I want to say funding rather than finance, just to draw a distinction for a second.
Thank you.
I'm referring, for example, to government grants, some of which have been around for years and years. They might go to building or repairing roads, improving transit systems or rail or other things, broadband. And we're going to need to build resilience standards into those. We're just starting that now. That's a good move, but we're moving too slowly in my judgment. And in addition to that, there's finance per se, what the private investment markets, capital markets do. And, we like to beat up on markets sometimes, and there's a lot more we should expect of them. We should ask markets to reflect our highest values. We should do that. I think it's important in any era. But sometimes markets do, you made the point with insurance, they're sending you a signal that your system of politics is struggling to respond to. It's unpopular to take certain moves, make certain proposals. It's too much change. People aren't ready for it, et cetera, et cetera. It's different when State Farm or Swiss Re say, we just can't.
Yeah.
Right? And the market is sending those signals. And another source of finance beyond insurance coverage now is, of course, selling bonds, for example, to finance infrastructure. It's been a major source for a very long time. In many ways, it works very well in this country, better than in most parts of the world. And you won't believe how popular bonds that have standards connected to them, environmental and social standards, just how popular they have become. We saw early signs of this overseas, by the way. Japan issued one of the world's first so-called green bonds. Flew off the shelves. Everyday investors wanted to buy these bonds that had certain standards, reflected in them. And people have common sense. They understand we need to be looking ahead. And so I think, we're going to see more and more of that kind of thing where the bond markets, which let's keep in mind, are way bigger than the stock market, where bond investors more and more signal that they want to see investment vehicles, bonds with certain standards to them that demonstrably manage and reduce the risks of a changing climate. We can't turn a blind eye to it, and markets are a part of how we get there, and finance is an important piece of it.
This is in part the conversation we were having with Stephen Rothstein last week from Ceres, and I had a similar conversation at a National Urban Land Institute meeting where balance sheets for some things that we just assume are chugging along in a conventional way don't reflect the real risks and or an address to the changes that are quite obvious, and they need to, and you're describing these bonds as being directly oriented towards an understanding of what the future is likely to be and an accommodation for that as reflected in what those bonds do and why people are interested in them. It would seem that What Works Plus, the organization that you lead, tries to pull a lot of this together. Different modes of funding and finance, organizations, governmental, non-governmental, foundations, philanthropy. Tell us a little bit about this organization and how it knits together the many strains of this discussion about the approaching impacts of climate change and what we're going to need to do about that financially, or as you point out, from a funding point of view.
Yeah, just a friendly correction, minor. I helped create it. We've got a great staff team, just all credit to them. They lead it, and I keep a hand involved. We've done a lot of projects.
I'm glad you pointed out that correction. As I'm looking at my notes, I realized I probably overstated that there, but I appreciate that.
No worries at all. We've done a lot of projects together, and the basic idea, we hatched this thing in the fall of 2021, so a few years ago, and we've let it evolve as we saw more of these major policy decisions kind of get enacted, the things we've been talking about, investments in advanced manufacturing and other kinds of local economic development, the big infrastructure deployment, of course, which will be happening for years and years, right? This is not stimulus spending. It's meant to flow out over 4, 5, 6 years, depending on the type of infrastructure. And what we realized, and the case that we took to philanthropies, foundations that have been working in communities all across the country around things like good jobs, affordable housing, creating more climate resilience, a whole host of different issues, we said to them, the good news is the public sector is about to invest in ways that the public has been asking for a very long time. This is terrific. And you have spent years and years in your organizations helping to seed important innovations, helping us understand what real educational opportunity looks like for everyone, what it means to close gaps in health and other indicators. Think of the way it was on all of our minds during the pandemic, for example, just
right.
the disparities in exposure to COVID and other things. And we said, look, bottom line, we need to lean in together and ensure that the conditions are there for this money to land effectively in communities, to see that there's equitable access to dollars, including in more disadvantaged communities. Some local governments in this country have one part-time,
Right.
assistant city manager who's never put together a federal grant application before,
Right.
staring at a screen that says there are 126 programs your community might be eligible for. You don't know, exactly how to access that money, what might be best for your community. If you're starting at square one, I mean. So funders really responded and, have agreed to work on over the last year and a half, everything from the sort of technical assistance that improves that access to money to some other things that are also even more forward-looking that we've been talking about so far, Duke, and that is think of the clean energy marketplace for a second and think of everything from putting clean energy on your roof if you have the ability to do that, rooftop solar, more efficient water heaters, heat pumps, that kind of thing to heat and cool your home. But also the kind of community scale, facilities that can pull down some of these tax credits and other federal resources. We think there need to be a set of clear mechanisms out there where public and private dollars can work together, make the money go farther, make it serve everyone, especially those who most need these investments. Cut your energy bill, make your community more resilient to power outages and things like that. And so that's what Works Plus is all about. And a really big piece of it, I have to add, is what some are calling the economic co-benefits, just a fancy way of saying we care about good infrastructure in and of itself, but let's have that conversation about access to good jobs. My colleagues have estimated we need 23 million new infrastructure workers over the next decade. Can you imagine? That's the population of Texas.
Right.
And we haven't traditionally invested in our people and our workers when we make the big investments in the stuff that they are to build or to make. And we need to change that. So we're showing how that's possible.
Yeah, and that points out the role of education at all levels in this country. High school, community colleges, universities like ours, and the building up of that workforce. And out here, I know we're paying very close attention to it because of what you just described. The need is obvious, and it's looming in front of us. The ability to do some of the things and do them better than we did in the past. You mentioned in passing places like Houston, where people often think of infrastructure as highways, and what it did and those highways did in the process of being dropped into these communities. We need to not only have people who can help build things, but people who can think through these things that are more equitable, probably the kind of work that you were addressing when you were at MIT and Harvard and elsewhere. So there's a workforce of all kinds related to infrastructure and doing infrastructure better. And of course, you point out in the geography of opportunity, it is a chance to remedy some of those problems, like the one I just described, which clearly had a racial component to them and other socioeconomic issues affiliated with what that infrastructure did to cities. I think that's what Justice Forty and other things that Secretary Buttigieg are trying to do, reconnecting communities. So it's a workforce that's needed on all levels, not just the building of the stuff, but the thinking through of the stuff. I assume that's something that you're still very much engaged in through your work.
That's exactly right, and couldn't say it better. No, it's talent of all kinds, from what people think of as skilled trades, which are super important, and can be terrific careers. A lot of our young people are not aware of them. And if they're women, let's be honest now, they may have fears that construction workplaces are not friendly to them, do not welcome them. We need to change that. We need to make sure these workplaces are all good and that people have accurate perceptions of the opportunities available to them and so on. But a lot of our young people, when you look at the best data, they think that a white-collar job, which they associate with a desk job, is automatically a good job and is the main source of good jobs. Either that or they are in love with, the creative economy and sort of being a social media content creator, that kind of thing. A small number of people make a living that way quite well, quite effectively, but a very small number. Many millions, could have good careers as an electrician, a coder, which is the backbone for everything these days, and these massive infrastructure sectors and a shifting, power industry, shifting to clean energy and so on. But we need to get accurate word out. We need to have entry points for people of all backgrounds. We need things like funded apprenticeships or so-called earn while you learn. Other countries do that. That's what they use to make it possible for people to actually connect to these careers.
The way you just put that, and maybe the way our conversation is going, the most significant infrastructural component of what we're talking about is the human component here. And thus education, training, access to technology looms large in these discussions. Everything else is dependent upon our ability to have that workforce upon which to draw and the insights to do it better than we've done it in the past. So I want to bring this home. You were speaking with Andy Donovan, the CEO of the Raza Development Fund. I think it's in one of your book chapters about community development in the critical climate decade. I think what you're suggesting is in addressing climate and the impacts it's going to have on businesses, on government, on communities, we can accomplish some other things which aren't directly climate topics, but they're lurking there. Talk a little bit about what you think by addressing climate we can also achieve and your optimism around that.
Well, the most important things, I think, are a healthier population. We know we spend more on healthcare in this country to get less than any other, advanced economy. We need to change that. So we're talking about healthier people, more of a focus on wellness and well-being, not just treating sickness. We will always need that, of course. But the things that enable people to access well-being. So that is a really important opportunity in what, as you say, Duke, tends to get labeled climate action, as though it were this specialty thing over here. So health is a big one, health and well-being. We've already talked about jobs and economic opportunity. There's a lot of innovation needed. There's a lot of work that needs doing, literally. And it runs the gamut. When I worked in the White House years ago and I helped to run the Office of Management and Budgets, I saw a lot of our government, all the different things from wireless broadband to transportation investments and much more. That one of the single most oversubscribed programs during the Recovery Act days was restoring ecosystems. People love it. They believe in coming together in their communities. They want to heal Mother Nature, truly, even if they disagree about all kinds of other things and the way environmental issues get discussed, they care about their local environment. I find that's true across, a wide spectrum of views and regions of the country. So
it's maybe one of the number one priorities per studies done here by the Center for the Future of Arizona.
Yep.
People think of this as a very beautiful place. It is. Number one criteria for a lot of people about what they want to see in the future isn't addressed to what you just described, the maintaining of a great ecosystem here. Often the reason that they moved to this place.
Yep. People deeply value it, and we can embed that right back in the center. And the other thing is business innovation, frankly. We're on the front end of creating, with a few colleagues, we've been calling it a new procurement economy or a supplier economy. It's going to take a lot of small and mid-sized businesses to do this work. It's not just the big companies like the ones we were talking about earlier, the computer chip makers. So there's opportunity in that if we can recognize it as such and be intentional about inclusion. We have a new industrial revolution going on of a kind. It's a very large-scale set of changes. And when you see that happening, you need to pay attention to, who are those suppliers? It's like the BMW story I told earlier. Who do you do business with? Are they local? Or are they not local? Are you creating those on-ramps? If we're intentional about it, we see so-called climate action as opening up all those opportunities.
So I'll ask you one last question. It relates to the Tenacross project, which has to do with time horizons and what we can do and what you can see, because you're clearly demonstrating we have a lot of data in front of us. We can see the future. We know where things are going. In the work that you do, and you mentioned it in terms of time in office, you're aware of those kind of time frames. In the work that you do, what kind of time horizons are you imagining that will make your work most impactful? What are you trying to address that would achieve something in X number of years or decades? How do you think about that?
It's such an important question, and at a moment like this, given that we're talking about some pretty big systems, that old aircraft carrier, metaphor, I place a lot of weight on on the middle distance, Duke. So on seeing significant, pivots, at least changes in direction over a 2, 3, 4, 5 year
Okay.
sort of span. I understand the urgency that folks in office feel about getting things done and being able to point to it, of course. And some of that will always.
Well, that's pretty urgent. 2, 3, 5, 6 years. That's pretty urgent.
It is. In one way, it is very immediate. But it's more than the months remaining in President Biden's term, for example. Yes. More than that kind of foot race, right. or the way a local mayor might think about the next election ahead, kind of thing. Again, understandable.
Fair enough.
That middle distance is extremely important. And I think I am hopeful, based on what I see in many different parts of the country, that with a relentless focus on that and taking the immediate steps to get us toward those pivots, those changes in mindsets too, we can take on the bigger questions, the kind of long-range stuff we were talking about earlier. Our community's doing fine today, but what are housing prices going to be 10, 15 years from now? Can my kids afford to live here?
Right.
Given the plant that's coming in or the sweeping changes that are happening. So I find focusing there, sort of enables me to sustain hope, and we all need that, but also keeps me and the people I work with honest and accountable for things that are tangible too, and that people can really see starting to change around them.
I think that's a great, logical, and clearly heartfelt answer. You want to achieve something, you want to be able to witness it, and identifying that time horizon as one where you think you can be optimally effective, I think is a great way to work. So Zav, I want to thank you for your time today and just your thoughtfulness and calm in the face of some really big challenges. I really love your approach to the work that you do and the way you articulate it. So thank you so much.
It's great to be with you, dude. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.